Gurdjieff believed that Christ used familiar moral stories to conceal precise psychological instructions meant for inner awakening. The parable of the Good Samaritan is one of the clearest examples of this hidden method. This parable is often reduced to a lesson about kindness or social ethics, but Gurdjieff would insist that Christ was speaking about inner states, inner divisions, and the structure of the human psyche. From this perspective, the story is not about becoming morally good or socially acceptable, but about the conditions under which real conscience and conscious action can appear in a sleeping human being. Gurdjieff saw this parable as a diagnostic instrument rather than a moral command, because it reveals why human beings so often fail to act even when they sincerely believe in goodness. Christ's teaching here is not comforting because it removes the illusion that good intentions, correct beliefs, or religious identity are sufficient for inner transformation. The parable confronts the listener with an uncomfortable truth, which is that awakening demands capacity, not opinion, and that capacity must be patiently built through self-observation, effort, and inner friction over time. It quietly exposes the gap between what a person claims to value and what actually governs their behavior in moments of pressure. This is why the parable continues to disturb sincere listeners rather than reassure them, because it points toward work that cannot be delegated, borrowed, or imagined, but must be lived directly. The parable begins with a lawyer standing up to test Christ by asking how to inherit eternal life, and Gurdjieff would immediately direct attention to the psychological posture hidden inside this question. The man is not asking out of inner urgency or existential suffering, but out of intellectual confidence and moral self-assurance, which already reveals a divided and defended inner state. He is trained in religious law, social authority, and correct interpretation, and his identity is built upon knowing what is right rather than doing what is difficult. He approaches Christ not as a seeker risking himself, but as an evaluator protecting his position. His question is framed as a test rather than a confession, and this framing silently determines the level at which the conversation can unfold. Gurdjieff taught that questions arising from personality always aim to protect image, confirm identity, or gain advantage, rather than invite real transformation. Such questioning seeks answers that can be possessed, quoted, or displayed, rather than answers that demand sacrifice of inner comfort and certainty. Christ responds in a way that is psychologically precise and deliberately unsettling, because he does not answer the question directly. Instead, he turns the question back by asking what is written in the law and how the man himself reads it. With this move, Christ refuses the role of external authority and removes the possibility of passive listening. He forces the man to confront his own knowledge without mediation, interpretation, or distance. The lawyer answers correctly, quoting the commandments of love toward God and neighbor, and in doing so demonstrates that ignorance is not the obstacle. At this moment, Christ exposes the real issue, which is the gap between knowing and being, between accurate understanding and lived capacity. This exposure is silent but exact, and it leaves no space for debate, clarification, or intellectual refinement. From a Gurdjieffian perspective, this reversal is central because it shifts the entire exchange from the level of ideas to the level of inner reality. Christ does not add new teaching to the man's mind because the mind is already filled with inherited truths and borrowed convictions. Instead, Christ removes excuses by revealing that knowledge alone does not generate the force required for conscious action. The man is left facing a question he cannot escape, which is why he cannot live with what he already knows to be true. This moment dismantles the comfort of blaming ignorance, lack of guidance, or insufficient instruction. The question becomes internal and personal, demanding a reckoning with inner weakness rather than outer confusion. Gurdjieff emphasized that most human suffering is born from this precise contradiction, where understanding accumulates while being remains unchanged. People gather moral ideas, spiritual concepts, and refined explanations, yet their actions remain governed by habit, fear, and automatic reaction. This creates inner conflict, guilt, and rationalization, rather than transformation. Christ's method exposes this contradiction without naming it, allowing the listener to feel the tension directly rather than analyze it safely. This inner discomfort is not accidental because it creates the necessary friction for self-observation to begin. Unable to remain in this exposure, the lawyer quickly asks a second question: who is my neighbor? Attempting to regain intellectual footing and moral control. The second question is not innocent, and Gurdjieff would identify it as a classic example of inner avoidance and self-protection. By asking for a definition, the man seeks to limit responsibility and reduce the scope of inner demand. If a neighbor can be narrowly defined, then obligation can be managed, delayed, or selectively applied without inner cost. This reflects a common human tendency to replace responsibility with classification. Christ responds by refusing all abstraction and instead offers a story that bypasses conceptual thinking and addresses inner capacity directly. The parable does not answer the lawyer's question, but dissolves it by exposing the deeper issue behind it. Christ then tells the story of a man traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho who falls among robbers, is stripped, beaten, and left half dead. Gurdjieff would interpret this journey as the descent of a human being from a higher inner orientation into mechanical life ruled by habit and reaction. Jerusalem symbolizes inner order, meaning, and a sense of higher aim, while Jericho represents dispersion, repetition, and absorption in external life. The descent is gradual rather than dramatic, reflecting how people lose inner coherence through daily distraction rather than sudden catastrophe. In modern life, this descent occurs through constant stimulation, ambition, resentment, comparison, and identification with roles and images. Each step downward feels normal, which is why the loss of inner presence often goes unnoticed. The robbers symbolize mechanical forces such as automatic thoughts, emotional surges, social pressure, addictions, and false personalities. They drain a person of attention and inner energy, leaving little capacity for conscious choice. The stripping represents the loss of inner resources, while the beating represents repeated shocks absorbed without awareness. The man is left half dead because the essence remains alive, but no longer governs life or decision-making. This reflects Gurdjieff's teaching that essence survives beneath personality, but is weakened, wounded, and easily overridden by habit. A priest comes down the road, sees the wounded man, and passes by on the other side. Then a Levite follows and repeats the same movement with different internal reasoning. Gurdjieff would say, these figures represent inner functions shaped by tradition, belief, social identity, and inherited morality. They know what is correct, but they cannot act because they are divided inwardly and governed by fear, image, and self-preservation. They recognize suffering conceptually, but lack the inner unity required for direct response. This reveals a severe truth, which is that morality learned from outside does not automatically produce conscious compassion or effective action. The Samaritan is introduced as an outsider, someone excluded from religious and social authority. Gurdjieff emphasizes that this detail is essential because real conscience does not arise from identification with group identity or moral status. The Samaritan represents a function within the human being that responds directly to reality rather than to image, fear, or expectation. Because he is less divided inwardly, he is capable of action without calculation or self-justification. His actions are practical, sustained, and responsible, showing that real compassion is organized, sober, and attentive rather than emotional or dramatic. At the end of the parable, Christ asks which of the three proved to be a neighbor to the wounded man. This final question completes the reversal initiated at the beginning of the dialogue. Christ does not ask who deserves help, but who acted from presence, responsibility, and inner unity. The lawyer answers correctly, but Christ does not explain further or offer reassurance. He simply says, "Go and do likewise," returning the teaching to the level of action rather than thought. From Gurdjieffian view, the question of spiritual life is never what is right, but what one is capable of doing under pressure. Christ's turning of the question back exposes the central human dilemma, which is that understanding does not equal capacity. Only sustained inner work can reduce this gap, and the parable leaves the listener alone with that responsibility. The teaching ends not with comfort, but with a demand that can only be met through conscious effort in ordinary daily life. This parable also contains a clear esoteric instruction for how inner work must be applied in daily life, rather than understood only as a moral story. Gurdjieff would say that Christ is not asking the listener to imitate the Samaritan outwardly, but to recognize when the Samaritan function appears inwardly and when it is absent. The practical work begins with observing moments when one sees suffering, disorder, or need, either in oneself or in others, and noticing which inner parts respond and which remain passive. Very often, the first response comes from the priest or the Levite within, offering explanations, delays, moral reasoning, or subtle avoidance. Seeing this reaction without justification is already a form of conscious effort because it weakens mechanical identification. In Gurdjieff's terms, the wounded man on the road also represents parts of ourselves that have been abandoned through years of inattention and mechanical living. The esoteric application of the parable is learning to notice inner suffering without immediately turning away from it. This means staying present with discomfort, confusion, or weakness long enough for real perception to arise. Most people rush to distraction, explanation, or self-blame, which only repeats the movement of passing by on the other side. The Samaritan function appears when attention is stable enough to remain with what is actually happening without defense or escape. Christ's instruction to go and do likewise means to act from the level of consciousness one has, rather than from ideals one admires. This requires small, concrete actions performed with awareness rather than dramatic gestures driven by emotion or self-image. Inner work here means helping only what one can actually help, beginning with attention, sincerity, and restraint. It also means recognizing that conscious compassion is impossible when inner life is chaotic and fragmented. Therefore, working to unify attention, regulate emotion, and observe thought is itself an act of Samaritan work. Gurdjieff taught that conscience is not created by belief, but by the slow accumulation of conscious impressions. Each time a person chooses presence over avoidance, something is nourished inwardly. Over time, this creates a stable inner function capable of responding to reality rather than reacting mechanically. The parable shows that this capacity is rare, not because people are evil, but because inner work is demanding and uncomfortable. Christ's teaching serves as both a warning and an invitation, revealing what is possible while exposing what is missing. Seen this way, the Good Samaritan is not a moral hero, but a symbol of what a human being can become through sustained conscious effort. The parable invites the listener to stop asking who is worthy of help. Instead, it asks, what kind of being am I in moments that demand action?